This year marks the 75th anniversary of artist Miné Okubo's illustrated memoir, Citizen 13660. Published in 1946, it was the first book-length account of America's concentration camps written by a former incarceree. Through a series of nearly 200 illustrations, each accompanied by a caption, Miné Okubo documented how World War II and the incarceration that followed upended her life. To commemorate the milestone anniversary of her iconic work, the Japanese American National Museum has organized the exhibition Miné Okubo's Masterpiece, The Art of Citizen 13660. Not only does the exhibit include 28 of the original drawings from her illustrated memoir, a second exhibition room highlights the art that inspired the 1946 book. A myriad of sketches she completed while incarcerated, a sketchbook, and a draft of the final manuscript. It is the first time this artwork and related materials have been exhibited. Okubo's interest in capturing the diversity of the incarcerated population at both Tanforan Assembly Center and Topaz resulted in several thousand quick sketches that developed into character studies, portraits, and scenes replicating daily life in the camp. These sketches, created while she was incarcerated, inspired drawings included in Citizen 13660. Two loose sketches show a number of incarcerees devising ways to carry cumbersome mattresses stuffed with hay back to their barracks, while other sketches show individuals sewing and women at wash tubs in a laundry room. Together, the materials in the Miné Okubo collection provide a glimpse into how Okubo witnessed and framed the telling of the World War II incarceration of Japanese and Japanese Americans. And now, for the first time, that artwork, as well as the materials that detail the creative process behind Miné Okubo's masterpiece, are being exhibited at the Japanese American National Museum, revealing the art of Citizen 13660.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. So pleased to be able to give you a preview of Miné Okubo's masterpiece, The Art of Citizen 13660. We've been working on this exhibition. It's morphed and changed over time over the last year. In early 2020, we were thinking about how we would fill this gallery, there was a gap in the exhibition schedule, and we thought it would be important to celebrate or at least recognize the centennial of the 19th Amendment and talk about women's suffrage, but more importantly, to talk about the fact that Japanese immigrant women and other women in the United States were excluded from the right to vote. And so we wanted to point that out, but also underscore that they made change in other ways. But as the pandemic continued and JANM remained closed throughout 2020, it seemed like we needed to shift our focus a little bit. There was, I think, so much interest in doing an exhibition on women. And that seemed like a monumental task because, we felt we needed to really do a lot of research and spend a lot of time working on an exhibition on women. And how do you choose? So we entertained that idea for a little bit. Miné Okubo was definitely one of the women we thought about highlighting. And then I will say that serendipity and collaboration have really been the through lines of this entire project. Two of my colleagues, so Jamie Henricks, our archivist, and Sean Iwaoka, our collections associate, were perusing the shelves one day and they stumbled across this real treasure. It was a draft of the Citizen 13660 manuscript in the Miné Okubo collection here at the museum, which came in 2007 through the stewardship of Karen Higa, who was a revered and beloved curator here at the museum. She helped to shepherd that collection in. And like most museums, there are large collections that aren't fully processed or fully cataloged or digitized. And in this case, we knew about the Citizen 13660 drawings, and those are often requested by members of the public, and they're up on our website. But we didn't know the full extent of what we have in the collection. And so it was going to be the task of our Getty intern this summer to help us determine what we had in the collection, to catalog it and to digitize it. And then it became like, oh, wait a second. Citizen 13660 has a milestone anniversary this year. So 2021 is the 75th anniversary of the first publishing of Citizen 13660. And so it seemed like the perfect exhibition for JANM because it would allow us to really highlight the collection. So that is the focus. The subtitle of the exhibition is The Art of Citizen 13660. We are literally displaying the art of Citizen 13660, but we also are highlighting or underscoring the skill behind the creation. And the collection here is amazing because the materials help us understand Miné's process and also help us understand the development of the book. And so that's sort of how we came to the exhibition. So I'm going to share my screen and just show you. So the exhibition opens today and it will run through February 20th of 2022. So you have plenty of time to come and visit. This is just an amazing photograph of Miné sketching, something that she was always described as having a pencil and sketchbook in hand. And it explains just how she was able to produce so much artwork throughout the incarceration. Miné Okubo is so prolific, and that's really one of the main points we wanted visitors to come away with. Just to give you an indication of how prolific she was, there's an artist profile in Trek, the literary magazine at Topaz, where she's interviewed about her artistic process. And she mentions that in just a few months, maybe 6 to 8 months, she'd created 1,900 sketches and in a month, 50 paintings. So she was incredibly prolific, and we have so many of those in the collection. And so again, it was our task or challenge to try to display as many of them as we could. And so we came up with these really creative ways, I think, to include more of her illustrations in the exhibition. But as we were doing our research, we thought, okay, she was doing all these sketches in camp. And then once she left Topaz in January of 1944 and went to New York, that's when she started to think about a memoir and publishing a memoir. But we learned that actually she had created the illustrations that become Citizen 13660 while she was in camp. And we know that because the reason why she left Topaz, Fortune magazine gave her an offer to illustrate one of their special issues for the April 1944 edition of the magazine. And so they were going to set her up with an apartment in New York. And at first she declined, but I think she saw it as potentially an opportunity for her to get her story out and also, further her artistic practice. And by the time she got to New York, she showed the editors of Fortune magazine 235 illustrations. Many of them became the final illustrations for Citizen. So we know that she was doing this creating these while she was in camp, and it's just incredible. In the artist profile, she also talks about just needing time to work on her artwork. She needed alone time. And so, this I think says a lot about her personality and work ethic, but she put up a fake quarantine sign on her barracks door and said she had hoof and mouth disease, so that people would leave her alone so that she could create. And create she did. She just produced so much incredible artwork. So just wanted to give you some context. But as Yuka's film will probably talk about, and we mentioned a little bit in the exhibition, Miné Okubo had this really burgeoning, amazing artistic career before the war. She had this really prestigious art fellowship that she received after getting an MFA at Berkeley, was traveling all around Europe right as war broke out in Europe. And her friends there encouraged her to come back to the US. She did. She was in the Bay Area working on a fresco with Diego Rivera and had so much promise. And World War II just really upended her entire life and her artistic practice, made her shift her focus, but she didn't stop, right? Instead, she decided that she was going to document her surroundings. And that's why we have this incredible body of work that says so much about the day-to-day experience in America's concentration camps. So as visitors walk in, they will see the 1946 edition of the book. And then from there, it sort of unfolds. So this is, I'm sitting right in front of this case here, but the exhibition is sort of divided into two parts. The first is more of like an art gallery. So there are 198 illustrations that comprise Citizen 13660. And so it was our task to select a small number. So we picked 28 illustrations, which was very difficult because they're all just so amazing and so detailed. But we wanted the illustrations to tell the narrative arc of Citizen 13660. And I think, one of the things that really struck me as we were doing research is when we were reading book reviews, when the book first came out in 1946, a lot of the reviewers felt that it was an important work that was shedding light on, this important topic, but felt that Miné used humor and that she was very objective and showed no bitterness. And it's just, I think, amazing to hear that, because when you look at the drawings, I think we see so much complexity and nuance, and that they're not objective at all. And they instead highlight the irony and the grief and the trauma, I think, that really characterized the incarceration experience. So that's another thing we wanted visitors to do, is to look much more closely at the drawings. In this case here, we have items from Trek. So Trek was a literary magazine produced at Topaz. They produced 3 volumes or 3 editions. There's some, Miné was the art director for this literary publication. And so a lot of her artwork is throughout the issues of Trek, including all the covers. So here's one of the illustrations up close. I think this is, it's hard to say that I have a favorite, but this is definitely one of my favorites. I think you get it so immediately when you look at this illustration. But this is the moment when Miné, who you see with the X or cross pattern shirt, arrives at Topaz in Utah, one of the 10 concentration camps in the United States. And in the background, you see this "Welcome to Topaz" sign. You see a band. She describes it, a Boy Scout troop from Berkeley was playing to welcome recent arrivals to Topaz. And then in the foreground, you see Miné and several other recent arrivals, and they have their arms up. They're shielding their faces from the inclement weather, the dust, the wind. And you see the irony, how could such an inhospitable climate be welcoming? And I think you see this throughout a lot of Miné's drawings. Something to point out, this is something that Rose Keiko Higa, this is one of her brilliant ideas. So this is an interactive. One of Miné's contributions to Trek was this map of topaz, and it sort of gives her perspective of what topaz look like. And there are a lot of landmarks that she notes, but also some things like mosquitoes or wind or mud or the sewer smell. And as we were looking at all of the items on the map, we started to put it together or piece it together. And we realized that there's so many illustrations in the book that matched what's mapped on this topaz map. And so Rose Keiko has created an interactive where you can flip up these panels and see illustrations from the book that are also on this map. So as you go into the second gallery, we wanted to show Miné's process of creating Citizen 13660. And so this is what the gallery looks like. We noticed in the collection, there's so many amazing materials again that show Miné's process. This is a sketchbook. And as we were looking at these sketches, we thought immediately, oh, there's so many illustrations that connect to the sketchbook. So you see some of the incarcerees, again, shielding their faces from the harsh weather and conditions. There are illustrations that show incarcerees stuffing mattresses. That's a sketch that you see here. So many sketches of incarcerees waiting in line. And then she also, in addition to creating hundreds of sketches of just daily life, she also kept a journal with these very succinct but incredibly vivid descriptions of daily life, little snapshots. So here she writes, "Man watching grass grow through large cracks in floor of barracks." And as we're reading this, we're like, oh, there's definitely an illustration that shows people watching grass grow. And I think it's just this commentary on just like the endless boredom that characterize the everyday. Also in the collection, so these are on the left, you see these sketches or character studies. Again, these are sketches that Miné did while she was incarcerated, and you see how they influenced final illustrations in Citizen. So here you see incarcerees with these really cumbersome mattresses, and they're trying to figure out ways of getting them back to their barracks. And you see these exact figures in the final illustration on the right. In the foreground, you see Miné and her brother Toku. And Miné, it's interesting, she's depicted in almost every illustration, sometimes kind of off to the side. You can tell she's the narrator, and sometimes she's in the middle of the action. We also noticed, since we have the draft of the manuscript and we also have the final illustrations, we noticed some differences. So here's an example of where an illustration changed. So on the left, you see Miné and her younger brother Toku with their luggage tagged with their family number, 13660. And you see that the style of the illustration has changed in the final illustration on the right. And we just thought that was interesting. And so we posed a lot of questions to allow the visitor to sort of come up with, for themselves, what they think the stylistic changes mean. Does it change your perception of the situation? Just the way that she depicts herself and her brother. So that's just a very brief overview of the exhibition. I don't want to give away too much because we want you to come and visit and see the exhibition. So now I'm going to turn it over to Rose Keiko Higa. And before I do that, I just want to say, again, serendipity has been just characterizing this project. So Rose Keiko Higa is Karen Higa's niece, and she has just been the perfect collaborator on this project, and just the perfect person to work on this. And I just know that her aunt would be so proud of all the work that she did, the research, the writing. So I'm going to turn it over to Rose Keiko now.
Thank you, Kristen, for such a warm lead up. So I have had the pleasure of being JANM's Getty intern, Getty Marrow, a multicultural intern. So this is an opportunity for people with underrepresented ethnic backgrounds to get a grant to work at museums all over Los Angeles. And I had the pleasure of being hired as Kristen's intern and working on this exhibition. So like she said, a lot of what my internship was about this summer was Citizen 13660, the artwork, and helping her to work with this collection, because when I started in June, there was a lot of it that was unprocessed, and for good reason. I think that the more we found out about Miné's prolific artistic ability, the more we realized that it would have taken so much time and energy, emotional and physical, to really work through this collection. And so it was no surprise that some of these later artworks that weren't pertaining maybe as much to the Japanese American incarceration experience had been left for a later date. And so that later date became now, when I started working, and I had the opportunity to start going through this collection piece by piece and cataloging it. So I've changed my virtual background to some of my favorite pieces that I've been working with. Gosh, which way do I move my head so you can see everything? And while we found out that Miné Okubo had produced thousands of sketches and artworks while incarcerated, it is nothing compared to her artwork post-war. And so we have 85 artworks and artifacts on display in the exhibition as of right now, and there are over 500 more in our collection. Not counting individual sketches, we have a lot of those sketches bundled up into categories. If we were to count those, I think it could very well be over 1,000 artifacts in this collection, which makes it even more incredible that Kristen was able to work her way through everything and choose these pieces for the exhibition. As of right now, I am the only person working at JANM currently that has seen everything in this collection. Hopefully, the goal of this processing endeavor would be to make this collection accessible. The documentation, digitization, we have an amazing staff at the collections department at JANM they've been working tirelessly to make sure that this collection is accessible and digitized and able to maybe have an online presence on the JANM website someday. But there really is a wealth of these paintings that describe Miné's post-war artwork and style and preferences that is so different from the artwork that she produced in camp. I think that we're producing work in camp really was a way to document and to process that experience. And afterwards, she was really able to embrace a lot of different styles and really become an artist that was not so focused on processing the trauma of a really difficult experience. And so in the future, hopefully, there'd be an opportunity to display some of these works that are really, a lot of them are colorful and beautiful. A lot of the subject matter is cats and children and women. And there's so much more that I could find out if I were to stay at JANM for years and years and years, but it's the collection that keeps on giving. And I think that Kristen has fit in all of the amazing things about Citizen 13660, but it doesn't begin to touch on the amazing life that Miné Okubo created through her artwork. Because it would just be, we would take up the entire museum and spill onto East First Street if we had tried to create that exhibition to encapsulate her entire life.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. to tonight's program. I want to start by thanking everybody for coming to our discussion. I want to thank the Japanese American Memorial Pilgrimages for hosting us, and Kimiko Mar, who is the master of everything. Tonight we have two of the incredible makers of the exhibition, Miné Okubo's masterpiece. I'll tell you that curation of an exhibition is never an easy task. There is so much factual data and just an incredible resources of material for this exhibition that Kristen had to conceptualize and develop. And then Rose Keiko came in and was a machine that was able to help Kristen with a lot of her thoughts. So I'd like to introduce first the Director of Collections Management and Access and Curator, Kristen Hayashi, PhD. And then I'd also like to introduce Rose Keiko Higa, who, as she said, was the Getty Merrow multicultural intern. So I have a few questions that I'm going to be asking them, but I do encourage all of your participation. If you're on YouTube, you just go ahead and type it in the live chat. And it's really your opportunity to be able to speak to a real curator. I think a lot of times people often ask, this is one of my first questions. A lot of times people ask, like, what does it mean to be a curator? What does a curator actually do? And I think it's a really an amazing profession. So that's my first question to you, Kristen, is what does a curator do?
Well, to be honest, I think I'm still trying to figure that out myself. But this collection, I think, was well curated before we even got to it, meaning that I think Miné Okubo herself had a hand in sort of putting this together, and so did Karen Higa, who was the JANM Curator, who helped to bring in the collection. The collection really was an exhibition that was like sort of in a box. And I think Rose Keiko and I just kind of refined it a little bit. Because if we did put everything in the collection out, it would be really interesting, but it would take years for visitors to pour through. So I think that was our task, was to try to pick the highlights. The items that we thought would help to best talk about Miné's process in creating Citizen 13660. And when it came down to picking illustrations, it was really hard because they're all so incredible on their own, but we wanted to pick, illustrations that would sort of tell the narrative arc. I think it's really important for the curator's voice to sort of be tempered and to sort of allow the visitor to explore the materials on their own. So we tried to keep, the commentary and the label copy short, and to pose some questions to allow visitors to sort of make their own observations and come to their own conclusions. So I think essentially that is sort of what a curator does, or at least that was our process for this exhibition.
So Japanese American, that answer. Rose Keiko, as a witness to the work that Kristen did, what do you think a curator does?
Oh my gosh, well, I do think that was a very JA answer, Kristen, because in my eyes, as an intern, being a curator, especially at a museum, of JANM size, a curator does so much. Curator assesses a collection and has to choose from a million different things what is the most important. And Kristen did a really incredible job of taking in all of this information that we were getting about this really incredible and prolific artist. And you could say so much about her, but the curator's job is to boil it down to some of the essentials, or the really important parts to stick to, because there are all of these really magnificent little details that you could get, you could fill up rooms and rooms with them, but Kristen had to choose, and that's really hard. And a curator also has to choose how to show you these artifacts that we have in the collection, because there are a lot of moments where you have to let the viewer make their own connections within the exhibition, but there are ways to guide them subtly. And Kristen did a wonderful job of that. And that's really, I think, part of what makes a really great curator is creating a show that someone can guide themselves through, but also has these suggestions of, thought-provoking questions that might lead the viewer to come off with a certain idea or thought about it.
Very good answer. I mean, I totally agree. There is a reserved aspect of, like Kristen said, letting the work speak, but controlling that and to navigate the visitor through. So yeah, no, really, both of your answers were really good. So, David has a question inside the chat. I don't know if you were able to see the Miné Okubo show at the Skirball, Kristen. And it was, I think it was slightly similar. It wasn't exactly similar. How do you feel? One, did you see the show? And then two, how do you think it differs from your exhibition?
I have to admit, I did not see the show at the Skirball. I have no excuse being here in Los Angeles, but I do know, I think they borrowed some works, some of the illustrations from the Citizen 13660 book for the exhibition. This was before I started at JANM, but I can guarantee that so much of what we have in our exhibition was not in the Skirball show, because again, a lot of this was uncatalogued, and we didn't know that so many of the sketches or even the draft manuscript for Citizen 13660 was in the collection, a few months ago. So it's all new. A lot of it is material that's never been displayed before. And so these are all the materials that sort of help illustrate the process from quick sketch to final illustration for Citizen 13660. So that's how it differs. Yeah. And again, we wanted to sort of, showcase Miné Okubo's work in sort of like a gallery setting. And then to sort of, underscore this was her masterpiece. And then the second gallery is more about the behind the scenes to the skill behind creating the manuscript for the book.
Yeah, I would second what Kristen said. I feel like the archive that Kristen put on display, if you come to see the show, you will be, I will say, blown away by just the depth of this archive. So definitely, and it's not a lot of recreations. You're seeing the real thing. So it's amazing. You can almost feel the artist's hand in the exhibition. Kristen, with so many, Miné Okubo is not alive, obviously, and so it is a lot of research, but it's also a larger question that you are dealing with currently, with a lot of our elders passing on, a lot of the Nisei leaving, and so many of the Sansei as well. How do you think your research is going to continue? Like, what were some of the research things that you had to do for this show? And how do you think it's going to continue on in the future? How you develop these exhibitions and stories?
Yeah. Well, again, we drew a lot of our research from the archive itself, but you'll have to come see the exhibition and see Yuka Murakami's film, which I think gives an overall or more comprehensive view of Miné Okubo's career from before the war to her post-war work. But I think that film is really important, not only because it shows her career more comprehensively, but it includes interviews with some of Miné Okubo's nieces, as well as some friends and scholars who did know her and could speak more about her practice. So I think that's really important, is interviewing individuals who, have the lived experience or know, the histories. So I saw in the comments that someone said, Miné was a good friend of my mother's. And, I've been hearing from different people just sort of anecdotally little bits about who Miné Okubo was, her personality, and a little bit more about her artistic practice. And it's really interesting because, that information isn't found, in secondary sources or primary sources either. So it's good to be able to collect those types of anecdotes and memories and stories about people. So I think that is very central to what we do here at the museum for all of our projects and our collections as well. We try to document as best we can using different types of sources, including, oral histories.
Thank you, Kristen. Emily Anderson has a question for both of you. She wants to know, what are your favorite sketches by Miné? And also, what are your favorite finished illustrations?
Want me to go first? Okay, there are hundreds of sketches in the collection that Miné Okubo created while she was incarcerated at Tanfren and Topaz. And we went through, all of them, especially Rose Keiko definitely went through all of them. And it's hard to pick, but there was one day there are two things. One, that illustration, we call it a character study. I don't know if that's what Miné would call it, but of the incarcerees stuffing mattresses. I just think it's so fun, even though it's such a laborious and mundane task. Like the way that she just illustrated these incarcerees, figuring out ways to carry this really cumbersome mattress, I think was, I don't know, it was just captivating. And then to see that some of those sketches were in the final illustrations was really incredible. So that was one. But there was this one sketch of an Issei man, and it was a very quick sketch of him, but it was the details that she put at the bottom. She put a time, it was 1:23 in the afternoon, and she had, I think, the date and also what I think is a barracks address. And there was something about that quick sketch that made me feel like I was in that room while she sketched it. I had this kind of reaction to it. So those are my two favorite sketches. And then I talked about my favorite illustration. You're not supposed to have a favorite, but I really do. And it's that Welcome to Topaz illustration, because I think that the irony comes through. It's so apparent, again, like we have this welcoming band, have these signs that say Welcome to Topaz. But again, how could such an inhospitable climate or environment be welcoming? So I think that really shows what I believe Miné Okubo's intention was for the book, is to show the irony through very accessible and relatable illustrations.
Oh gosh, Kristen, you talked about some of the really great, the great ones there. Since so much of my outside of the exhibition work was spent looking at the rest of the Okubo collection, I think a lot of my favorite sketches and final paintings and illustrations are some of Miné's post-war work. There are some really beautiful sketches that she made during camp. We do have one in the exhibition of parents who have put their children in these big sinks that are used for laundry, and they're bathing them. And that's not a experience that's isolated to being incarcerated, but to think that she would have sat in this laundry room and watching people go through every day and experience their lives, to do the laundry, but also to make the most of it. She also has a couple of them with fully grown people popping themselves in these huge sinks to take a bath, because a big part of being Japanese American is bath culture, and not having access to an ofudo, I'm sure, was a very big inconvenience for a lot of people who are missing that. But in her post-war work, there's so much color and joy that is not really always present in some of these illustrations from camp. I think she does a good job of giving a really comprehensive view of what camp was like, but I think that her post-war work hopefully in the future will be showcased, or at least on the JANM website, because some of it is really, it's different. And I think it's worth seeing.
Thank you. I really feel like the example that Kristen had mentioned really does, was very successful in communicating this ideal of the irony and the pathos, sort of the humor that, what was happening was awful. These people were stuffing their beds, but in that moment, they would wrap the thing around their head. And, I think she was just seeing the ridiculous event that was occurring in front of her and sketching it and capturing sort of the oddity of this whole thing, what was happening to them. And so I think that in those sketches, it conveys that feeling really well. The sort of the tragedy, but also in that weird moment, these kind of odd, how they were trying to carry these huge bags with hay, back to their barracks. So ironic. So, okay, there's a lot of questions now. So Dexter has a question about, he appreciates all the research you did and everything, but he wants to know what surprised you the most about what she was communicating. Kristen?
That is such a good question. And I saw it and I've been thinking about how to answer this. I think what's so amazing is I've been studying the World War II incarceration experience for, a number of years. And to be honest, I had not read Citizen 13660 prior to last year. I knew about it, but never really thought to look at it. And when you read it, it's like so much about what we know about the incarceration experience was written in the captions or expressed in the illustrations in 1946, when, again, this was still a current event. It wasn't even recent history yet. And if we had just started there, it is all right there, which I think is maybe surprising. We just had to go to Miné Okubo's Citizen 13660 to get a very candid and comprehensive overview of what daily life was like in camp. So surprisingly, that was surprising to me. I think the other thing too is just the way that she talks about how heterogeneous the community was. I think there's a tendency to think that the Japanese American community was so tight knit and it was very, homogeneous. But she alludes to differences generationally, I guess, between Issei and Nisei. She definitely has her opinion, or she often sticks her tongue out at the Issei men and doesn't really understand their way of thinking. When she first gets to, I think it's Topaz, she's supposed to be living in this block with a lot of Issei bachelors, and she and her brother asked to be moved because they don't feel a connection. They feel very different from these Issei bachelors. So I thought, that was sort of interesting as well. So those are just a couple of things.
That's a great question, Dexter. Thank you. I think a great part of this collection, especially, Kristen is right that Miné really does show there's this really amazing story that she's telling with all of these details. And I read this in school in LAUSD. What Citizen 13660 is required reading. I think it still is. But going and getting to see this collection, there's edits to the text, to the manuscript. You can see this process because Kristen did touch on this, that it was published in 1946 when there was still a camp that was open. And this wasn't anything that was old news. It was history that was happening, or it was a current event. It was still ongoing. People were in the process of relocating. And so the way that Miné had to tell this story very clearly was monitored, probably by herself and by other people. And you can see the process through these materials of, what she might have wanted to say, what she might have wanted to depict, and how that changed over this very short time period where she decided, I'm going to write this book and then I'm going to publish it and have it available to the public. All of these decisions she had to make in such a short amount of time, and they're all really, really interesting.
One other thing too, I guess, is we've observed different styles, a way that she sort of depicted daily life. Like the illustrations in Citizen 13660 are very different from these quick sketches that she did which are very different from the charcoal sketches, which many of you have seen. They're about 13 in JANM's collection, but those are much more abstract and I think definitely convey the trauma of the experience. And so I think that's, also interesting to think about, like how these different styles communicate, I think, the experience in different ways. So that's something.
So there's a lot of good questions coming up. One is again from David Fujioka. He wants to know, how did she get all of these artwork, that were drawn in camp and transport them cross country after leaving camp? Maybe you could talk a little bit about how she went to New York and all that stuff.
Another really great question. Yes, again, these sketches, like the paper, is paper. It's meant to be somewhat ephemeral, right? But most of the sketches are so pristine, right? There are very few that have like creases, or there are very few that are dog-eared, or it is amazing that they are 75 plus years old, right? Yeah, how did she transport, hundreds of these sketches with her to New York? I don't really have the answer to that, but she must have, or maybe they were shipped ahead. I don't know. That's possible too. But what is really interesting, and this remains a mystery. So again, we keep calling them the original illustrations for Citizen 13660. And those are what we have framed in the exhibition. And looking at them, the paper is incredibly white. You don't really see like impressions from a pen. They're really incredible. And so we're not sure if these are like the illustrations that were used to make the book, or if they are like not a copy, but she did them originally, but a later iteration. We're not sure, but I think there still are some questions in terms of timeline. And again, we don't know exactly how she did transport all this amazing artwork with her to New York. But you're right, they're in incredible condition.
David has a follow-up to that as well. He wants to know that during her time in, were all the sketches completed in camp, or were some of them created after leaving camp? And I think, again, this is connected to the, it's very similar to what your research has been finding.
Right. So we thought, okay, all these sketches she definitely did in camp at Topaz and Tanforan, because that issue of Trek, that artist profile, she talks about these sketches that she was doing. We have photographs of her sketching. We know she was sketching nonstop while she was in camp. We thought that once she got to New York, that's when she started to take a lot of those quick sketches that she did from camp and use those as inspiration for the drawings. But then we also realized from reading the Fortune April 1944 issue is what, Fortune hired Miné to do some artwork for that issue of the magazine. And that's, she went to New York because Fortune was sponsoring her. And there's a note, there's an article in the Fortune magazine that talks about how Miné Okubo came to New York with 235 illustrations, and that she was finishing or was thinking about a book. I can't remember exactly the language, but mentions this book. And there is an article called Ise Nisei Kibe in the issue, April 1944 issue of Fortune magazine, that talks about the Japanese American incarceration experience. It's very thorough and comprehensive, pretty amazing. Anyway, a lot of those illustrations that ended up in Citizen 13660 are in that issue, which means that she did the illustrations that ended up in Citizen 13660 while she was at Topaz. So again, so prolific. I don't think she ever slept. She was just producing constantly. That being said, it's possible that she definitely, actually we know she was doing some sketches from memory, because we do have a sketchbook that has sketches from the incarceration as well as like scenes from New York. So those were done when she was in New York.
Okay. We're so honored to have author Ken Mochitsuki here. And, he has a good author question for you. Do you know if Miné had to make any concessions demanded by the publisher to get Citizen published? And I think Kristen has a good answer for that.
The answer is don't know for sure. However, there are some, I think we wonder about this, like how candid was she with some of the captions? Are those her true, is that her true perspective? Or is she really thinking about audience and maybe tailoring the captions, thinking about who the audience for this book might be? I don't know. But in terms of like, was she required to make certain edits? I'm not really sure. Again, we do have a draft of the manuscript. And so we know that in most cases, the edits that were made to the text were pretty minor and I think meant to make the captions more succinct or readable. But there are a few cases, and we have those exhibited, where we felt that the draft manuscript text and the published text were different enough where it changed the meaning. There are some pages of the draft manuscript that have Miné's like edits, like her handwritten edits, and not all those made it in. But most of the time it didn't really change the meaning. But again, there were a couple where the published version sort of reads more like a WRA version of the Wakasa shooting incident, for example, or when it comes to dilemmas that incarcerees felt about leaving camp, I mean, I think that was sort of toned down too. So again, I don't know if who made those decisions on what the final text was, but it is interesting to observe those. But there also is, so Okubo did submit an essay that was published in the San Francisco Chronicle, and that was edited to include excerpts from one of Dylan Meyer's speeches. So that's a case where there were edits that made it sound very, pro-American and WRA-like, I guess.
Rose Keiko, did you have any observations?
I think Kristen covered a lot of it. I think there's maybe some speculation about what level of involvement the WRA had in Miné Okubo publishing Citizen 13660, and we just will never know. And you can look at it and look at this material from a lot of angles and also see some of these like floating edits, some in those manuscript pages. Sometimes there are questions, but it's unclear who posed them and who's making the final say. And, Miné Okubo she was a smart woman, and she also probably had to impose some concessions on her own work because she knew the political climate. She knew who was going to be buying this book. And so she had to, there's a lot of her artwork that's really different than Citizen 13660. It's a totally different style. It's a different, and her personal correspondence is very different than the caption, the style of writing. And I think that's true for many people, that their personal feelings are different from what they publish. But it's hard to tell with all of those little things. I don't know if we'll ever find out, but it's interesting to look at it all and maybe make your own opinions.
Thank you. Good answers. And I think Ken in his other commentary captures it as well. He understands everything you guys are saying, because there are, like you mentioned, Kristen, the introduction that quotes Dylan Meyer, and so that the publisher has some input into that, what is being communicated. There's a person, Ono Kao Kao. That sounds making me hungry. It's dinner time. So, and this is more of an artistic question. How does Miné Okubo's style differ from Chura Obata, for example, since they were both at Topaz? Kristen?
I know. I don't know enough about Obata's work at Topaz to really make the comparison, but what I will say is interesting is I think that Okubo is definitely making a statement about camp in ways that cameras could not. And I think you definitely see that in one of the media pieces that's in the exhibition that Shani Waoka and Evan Kodani and May Kono created helped to make the static images more dynamic. What they've done is they've paired some of Miné Okubo's drawings with home movie footage in our collection from Topaz. And I think what's so interesting is, some of the home movie footage from Topaz, people are waving because there's a camera around, and that's what you do when there's a camera around. And then, next to that, juxtaposed with that, you see one of Okubo's sketches that depict the same sort of scene, and it's a very different depiction. And so I do think that she is giving, again, sometimes she uses humor, sometimes they're all relatable and accessible, but if you look closely, you really see the complexity, and sometimes it's very apparent. But that's what I would say about Okubo's work. Clement, maybe you know more about Obata and you can comment.
Or Rose Keiko, or
Yeah.
Well, I have not spent a lot of time with the Obata collection, but from what I've seen of his artwork from camp, I think a lot of what I've seen the most is, his most famous works are landscape pieces, and he does his work is very beautiful, even in these really harsh climates. Topaz was kind of like a wasteland. And he has this really great painting of the super fiery sunset, happening over this really flat land. But I have also seen sketches, especially one where he's sketching this Wakasa shooting that's happened, and he has a little note on the bottom, and it's emotional. The sketch is emotional. It's very quick, but documenting. And so, not having really seen this full collection or not knowing the extent of the collection, I think it's probably really true that there were a lot of artists who had the work that they felt like they wanted to produce, for their sanity, for their hobbies, to create something beautiful in a place that was not beautiful or that didn't feel like home anymore. But without having this ability to look at every single little thing, because Miné Okubo saved everything for us, which is a real gift. But I'll never know if Chiyoda Obata had all of these sketches, if he documented the everyday life as well, because he might have, especially, so you see that little snippet of the Wakasa, and you think, okay, well, that's something that stuck with him. And I'm sure there was a lot more.
Doesn't everybody want to be a curator out there? So these are such a great, I appreciate so much the depth of thought that, that goes into every move that they make for this exhibition, the kind of care and consideration. I would agree, that Chiyoda was a Issei, so he had a much different perspective on life at that time than Miné, who was still in her 20s and who had gone through a complete Western education, learning, graduated from Cal, went to Europe to study art. And so, their perspectives and experiences, I think, were much different. And so, before Miné went to camp, she was working literally under Diego Rivera, who was painting frescoes on a ceiling while she was demonstrating, how to do that technique for visitors walking by. So just their influences. But like Rose Keiko said, the Wakasa shootings physically impacted them to the point where they had to document this experience in whatever way they knew how to. And I think the only thing I would say about Obata is that he did use a lot of symbolism in his work, in spite of being more of a traditionalist, that as we look at and appreciate his work too, I think he was saying things, maybe not as literally as Miné was, but saying them nonetheless. So. Yeah. So, okay, here's here's a question for Rose Keiko. We know that your auntie was Karen Higa. And, in many of our eyes, Karen Higa was, she's very high on the pantheon of curators. So how did that feel for you coming into this opportunity here at the museum? And I don't know, how did it make you feel?
Well, there are big shoes, and I did not step into this role assuming that I would ever fill them. But there is something very similar to like a homecoming about working at JANM, especially in my first day when I was greeted with my desk that had a large picture of Karen Higa when I think taken at 26 or 27. And so I don't know, I think that she gave me a real gift of early life art appreciation and museum education from the get-go, and that was all at JANM. And this experience, especially working with Kristen as a mentor and as a role model, there's a lot that can happen when you're 21 and you're figuring out your career and your education, but if I ended up as a curator, then wouldn't that be a dream? I think I would be pretty satisfied if that became my career. If I could create an exhibition like Kristen has created and like everyone at JANM has been able to, work with, I would be very, very pleased. We'll see.
Okay, good answer. David Fujioka is asking the same thing. If you will be a museum curator in the future, and I think you answered that. So we're getting close to the end here, but I think I'd like to ask one final question. Well, I guess David has a question. If anyone knows, did all the camps have at least one prominent artist documenting everyday life? And he mentions Estelle Ishigo for Heart Mountain. I think. I mean, I would have to think about that for a while, but Kristen, do you know?
Yeah, I was trying to think about that too. Yeah, I mean, we have like the Henry Sugimoto collection. He was at Roar. He was at Jerome. And then like Jack Murrow from Amachi, and I'm just thinking about our collections at JANM. But thinking about Minidoka, I'm trying to think of an artist that comes to mind from our collections there. But that is a very good question. Minidoka had Kenjiro Nomura. Okay, thank you. Yeah. And Poston was really interesting too. There were a lot of like animators who were like teaching classes there and influenced a lot of artists there. But that's a good question. We need to explore further.
Yeah, I'm sure there's more than one for every camp. It's mostly about you finding them. Because when you say Heart Mountain, I think Benji Okubo.
That's right.
But yeah, I imagine, I mean, Miné Okubo she figured it out for herself, but being incarcerated, that, she was abroad, she was, living her life in her late 20s, early 30s, she was an artist, she had all of this stuff that she was doing, she had to stop doing it for, years to go and sit in Utah. So I'm sure that there are a lot, and even her mother, who's wasn't Issei, wasn't incarcerated, she passed away, but she was an artist. Her life got complicated. So I'm sure if you look, there are archives full of notable artwork that you just have to find it. All of these people, all of the papers.
John Tonai also points out Isamu Noguchi posted, albeit very short. So I just want to close with one last question for both of you. And you two have become so immersed in all of Miné's thoughts and her creations. If you could ask Miné Okubo one question, what would you ask her? Rose Keiko.
Oh no. Oh my gosh. That's a really hard question, Clement. I think I would have to ask her what her driving force was to create artwork post incarceration. I think that it was a part of her being about who she was. She needed to create all this artwork. She also needed to save it all in her apartment. But I would love to know about her influences and what drove her to create these, thousands of paintings afterwards every day, and to sometimes live without electricity or heat to do this.
That's a good question.
One question so hard. Like, I want to know where the accent over the E came from. But I guess more seriously, I would want to know where the courage and audacity came from to publish this memoir. I mean, to be a Japanese American woman in New York in 1944, 46, like, couldn't have been easy, and it must have taken, again, a lot of courage and audacity. So where did she get the strength to do that? And then how did she react to these reviews about the work, and when people said, oh, she uses humor, there's no bitterness, or she's so objective, we wanted more emotion, like, what would she say to that? Because we don't see that at all. So I would have lots of questions for her.
Okay. All right. So we're past the hour now. And so I just want to thank my two guests for the two stars of the show, Kristen Hayashi and Rose Keiko Higa. Again, want to thank all the people who came to listen and chat with us. And I want to thank again Kimiko Mar and the Japanese American Memorial Pilgrimages. So please share this video. It'll be on their website. Share it with all your friends. Post it on your Facebook page or your Instagram. And we look forward to many more programs coming up as part of the Japanese American Memorial Pilgrimage program, Tadaima. So, okay, thank you.
Thank you.